Moving on to looking at a contrast and comparison of James and Charles I. So in terms of personality, James was already an experienced monarch when he took over the English throne in 1603, having governed Scotland since 1567. So he took over after Mary Queen of Scots was ousted from Scotland, and he was approximately 18 months old when that happened. So he had regents who acted on his behalf, and then he secured the throne by himself at the age of 17 upwards. So he's already kind of proven himself as a monarchy. He's also a descendant from the Tudor line. He has already produced children as well and is also married. So he's deemed to be quite a natural successor to the Tudor throne when Elizabeth, the last Tudor, dies in 1603. Now, in terms of James's personality, there's quite a lot of kind of historical argument over him as an individual. Some argue that he could be quite vulgar and impatient with a secure inner circle of advisors, and therefore he wasn't willing to open up his circle of advisors to those that he wasn't close with. Others argue that he was well educated and professional in his mannerisms. He was educated as a Protestant and therefore was very consciously aware of the different religious groups that existed within Europe at this time. And he's written quite a lot of his own books, particularly at the height of witch hunting in Scotland in the 1560s, whereby witch craze took off. And as time progressed into his reign, he wrote books such as Demonology, and he was also quite interested in theatre. So he was quite cultural, he's quite well educated. Now, if we kind of scroll down in your pack to Charles I, Charles was completely different to James. He was shy, he had a speech defect, and that meant because of that, he was quite conscious of how others viewed him, and he was therefore reluctant to engage with politicians because he didn't want to be undermined by them. Charles's inferiority complex consequently resulted in him overstressing his prerogative and was unwilling to compromise, and this becomes quite significant later on within the unit when we have a look at the Civil War, his relationships with Parliament, and ultimately the negotiation process when Charles is incarcerated on the Isle of Wight, and Parliament are kind of depicting what they're going to do with him in terms of putting him on trial or executing him. Now, we could kind of argue that perhaps by modern day standards, Charles is maybe autistic or something along those lines. That's not quite a commonly accepted learning challenge to have in this time period, and therefore he doesn't have the natural qualities of a king as far as Parliament are concerned. He doesn't have the confidence that his father has, and he certainly doesn't have the communicative skills that are required at times of stress between Parliament and Crown. Charles was also very anxious of conspiracy theories, of people plotting against him, for example, and regardless of whether there was proof or not, he often arrested people regarding conspiracy theories, and he saw any sign of criticism of him or his reign as a potential for rebellion. So he was a very paranoid leader, not particularly confident in his own ability, nor particularly confident in the support of his advisors, apart from his very close inner circle, particularly with Buckingham. Now, if we have a look at the monarchs' views regarding their role, James and Charles were both firm believers in the divine right of kings. That is, they have been put on earth by God with which to rule their kingdom, and therefore they're fiercely defensive of their royal prerogative, their birthright to govern, and therefore they both perceive parliaments to be sinful in some ways when they challenge any requests that they have or any policies they wish to put forward, which are then challenged by Parliament. They don't see Parliament as godly. They are elected members of Parliament. They are not godly figures, and therefore they believe that any parliamentary criticism of their work or their reign is going against God's will. And they're both very, very defensive of that royal right that they're born into. James, however, saw himself as something called a Rex Pacificus, and this means that he wanted to be seen as a peacemaker of Europe, which was signified by his ending of the war with Spain, which he had inherited from Elizabeth I, and by marrying his children off to different religious monarchs. So his daughter was married off to a German prince within the Austrian-Hungarian area of Germany, and obviously there were negotiations with his son Charles in initially marrying the Spanish Spanish Infanta, with the Madrid campaign with Buckingham. That then fails, and he's then married off to Henrietta Maria in France, both of which are Catholic women. So therefore he wants to kind of put England on the map in terms of being this negotiator between Protestant, Puritan and Catholic communities by marrying off his children to different religious monarchs. And James believed it was his historical right to fulfil the union of England and Scotland. This caused slight tension with the English Parliament, who did not want foreign Scottish influence within the English Parliament. And this is something that he wanted to achieve, given that he was James VI of Scotland as well as James I of England. However, it's something that is never achieved in his lifetime. If we then scroll down to Charles, Charles, as already said, was also a firm believer in divine right of kings and was very defensive of his royal prerogative. The King Charles has many more clashes with Parliament than James ever did. So there's a lot of kind of verbal fighting over the political nation, who has most power. Charles believes that he has a birthright of having power over Parliament and therefore can demand whatever he wishes to from Parliament. In contrast, though, Parliament believe that actually we now have a situation of king in Parliament, so having to work and negotiate together as opposed to having two separate individual powers. And therefore that clash is almost a byproduct of Charles's lack of self-confidence, and this results in the inflexibility of power between Crown and Parliament. Crown, i.e. Charles, is not willing to back down over what he believes is his birthright. Parliament, in reaction to that, believe that Charles is an absolutist who wants to act on his own. Hence, they believe that due to the amount of dissolution of Parliament that Charles does within his reign. And Parliament is keen to reduce this absolutist nature, because if Charles becomes an absolutist monarch, there is therefore not a need for Parliament in general. Now, in terms of the Crown's court, James was described as a drunken, immoral and debauched court. James was a very fond supporter of parties and supporting those closest to him, very Henry VIII-like in his mentality. However, there were also features of Shakespeare reflecting Elizabethan culture and James's love for literature. So it was a very culturally enhanced lifestyle in James's court, particularly in the early years of his reign. However, the English court experienced tension due to foreign influences from Scotland, though court tension did not reduce when James appointed the first Englishman, the Duke of Buckingham, in 1615, who was not particularly popular for reasons that you should be aware of, and we will go over later within your pack. Now, in contrast, Charles's court was strict in the running of his court and only permitted those into his court who were his key supporters. This isolated many from having any political influence and fueled resentment towards the crown and evil councillors. Charles doesn't really have a flamboyant court. He has those that are close to him, and that is it. Now, a common favourite of Charles and James was Buckingham, so George Villiers, and he is favoured by both James and Charles in the period 1615 to 25, so a 10-year period. And Buckingham was allowed a dominant role in the management of royal patronage, i.e. those who gain favours within the monarchy and those who gain titles. So this made Buckingham very unpopular, that in order to have the ear of the king or support of the king or titles and favours from the king, you had to be on the side of Buckingham, and this made him very unpopular amongst the members of Parliament. And this then forced others to look to Parliament in order to pursue their interests. Buckingham was a source of political tension in the period 1618 to 28, as he's often portrayed as an evil counsellor by parliamentarians. This is for a number of reasons, in the fact that any campaign that Charles was involved in, Buckingham was also involved. Buckingham also gave conflicting advice to the monarchy in comparison to what Parliament were advising. Buckingham was also involved in many military campaigns that proved to be ineffective, a failure or unpopular. And as a result of that, Buckingham was not favoured by anyone other than the monarch. There were a couple of people favoured by James that you don't need to know as much detail, but the Duke of Lennox is someone that he favoured within the Scottish Parliament. And before the arrival of Buckingham, we have the Earl of Somerset, or Robert Carr. And Robert Carr is quite significant in drawing up some of the earlier policies of James within his reign. He, however, dies in 1613, and as a result of that, there is a 2-year interim period before the arrival of the Duke of Buckingham, who becomes the main favourite for quite a good proportionate of pre-Civil War Stuart Britain.